We had every year DMS does a yearly event, and interestingly enough, this year it was the first year where when I was talking to investment managers, talking to family offices about topics they wanted to discuss, the compliance was the number one topic.
I'll talk now to Francine Balbina. She is the Executive Director for DMS Governance for Latin America. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like you to talk about the scenario of compliance here in Brazil regarding the offshore business.
Oh, compliance has been the word of the year. To not say the century because we're too young, so I'll be kind to us. Not only in Brazil, but everywhere, compliance has been very, very important. So what we've seen in terms of the offshore market is a huge amount of compliance. So there's a lot of new regulations. We had FATCA, that we have now upgraded to FATCA, which is CRS, the Common Reporting Standards, which I like to call the global FATCA. So that's a lot of compliance because going forward, over 90 countries will exchange information. We have in Europe AIFMD, which is the Alternative Investment Management Directive, which is more compliance the managers have to worry about. So there is, when you're thinking of banking, there is Basel III, there is a lot of new regulation rules in regards to AML for clients. So there's a lot of different things to take into account. And we had a lot of things in Brazil as well. So for the fund industry, CVM came out with the CVM 558, the 558, which is new regulation that the investment managers will have to follow. So it has a lot to do with, they'll be able to distribute their funds, but they have to do, there's a lot of things they need to comply with in order to be able to do distribution. So it definitely has been a big topic. We had, every year DMS does a yearly event, and interestingly enough, this year it was the first year where when I was talking to investment managers, talking to family offices about topics they wanted to discuss, the compliance was the number one topic. To give you an idea, in the previous years, people wanted to talk about capital raising, people wanted to talk about structuring, different countries where you can structure your offshore funds, how to raise capital. And this year, the most popular topic was compliance. So there's definitely a lot more compliance, which means, of course, more costs. So when I think of offshore, when I think of a new manager trying to set up an offshore structure, it's going to be more expensive because it does need to think about CRS. If it's going to be in Europe, there is AIFMD. So there's different things that a manager needs to consider. But it also brings a lot more transparency to an investor. So from the investor side, I think now we are in a world of exchange of information, of there's nowhere to hide, so you need to run a good business. And when I make a connection with Brazil, we saw that in the Lava Jato, in the car wash investigations, where governance, best practices, and compliance have been very, very important. So all the companies that are involved, there was a lack of good governance, there was a lack of best practices. So I think it's overall, it is the topic of it is the topic of the year, to say the least. There has been a lot of developments in terms of compliance globally.
How long have you been here in Brazil, and who is the target client?
So DMS has been here in Brazil for 6 years. Our target clients, I'll divide them in two buckets. We have the asset managers, so mainly independent asset managers, but also the asset managers from arms of corporations like banks and insurance companies, and then the multi and single family office. We had, due to the economy in Brazil and the political stages that we saw in Brazil, we had a change in the client's profile. I shouldn't say a change in the client's profile, I'll rewind. We had different clients interested in the service because of the way Brazil was what was going on in Brazil. So to give a practical example, in 2012, Brazil was growing a lot. The economy was great. China was growing. So there was a lot of independent asset managers wanting to set up an offshore fund to attract international investors. So they wanted to do capital raising and attract international investors to invest back into Brazil. This year, and I would say 2015, 2016, it was different. We saw the economy not doing well. We saw that the international investors were not happy with Brazil. A lot of them did not want to invest further. Some of them withdrew money from Brazil. So what we saw was, and then with the whole impeachment process and everything else that was happening here, we saw families that have a business in Brazil, that are invested in the real economy in Brazil, wanting to diversify their investments and invest a percentage abroad. So those families wanted to structure an offshore fund, not to capital raising, but to invest, to diversify their investments. So it's a completely different profile of clients when you're talking to family and what is important to them, what they look for in a structure, how they look at governance, how they look at best practices. Is very different because it's their own assets, it's their own money. So it's very different from a manager that is raising capital from third party. So we saw that difference. Like we always target investment managers in family offices, but for the past 2 years, because of the economy in Brazil not doing so well, we saw a good number of families wanting to invest abroad, which we didn't see before. Before, people were saying, no, I'll invest in Brazil, fixed income in Brazil has good returns, I don't need to diversify, I have my business here. We saw that changed because of the economy in Brazil. So there was a change of the more active clients. So there was a lot more action from families than from managers, because managers were having a hard time capital raising because of the economy.
What's new in the relation between Ireland and Brazil?
Oh, so we just had news about Ireland and Brazil. So Ireland was just added to the Brazilian IRS, Receita Federal, blacklist of tax havens. So what it means is Brazil, the Brazilian IRS, the Brazilian Receita Federal, usually they look at countries like, if you don't have 20% or more in taxes, you are considered tax haven for Brazil purposes. Ireland was not on that list before, but as of September 2016, so September this year, they were added to the list. The challenge is now Ireland is a huge center for funds, for investment funds. And we have, of course, a number of Brazilian investment managers that set up funds in Ireland to raise capital in Europe, especially because with AIFMD, if your goal is to raise capital in Europe, you need to have an European-based fund. So the impact is now when this manager sets up this Irish fund, if they want to invest back into Brazil, they'll have a taxation burden, so they will be hit with more taxes because they're coming from a tax haven. So when I think of the main jurisdictions for funds, now for Brazilians, the best jurisdiction in Europe will be Luxembourg, because Luxembourg has a taxation agreement with Brazil that avoids double taxation. And they're not on the blacklist for the Brazilian IRS. So I'm sure it will impact the Irish industry from a Brazil perspective. So you're not going to see a lot of Brazilian managers wanting to set up a fund in Ireland because they'll be treated as a fund coming from tax haven and have different taxations on that. So they were just added to that list.
What do you foresee for offshore businesses for next year?
For next year, I'm optimistic because we had the impeachment process. We are seeing all the investigations and everything that is going on in Brazil. So it's been sending a positive sign to investors. So from the conversations we have with investors is until the impeachment process was finalized, they were not really looking at Brazil because Brazil was not growing, there was not a lot of opportunities, and they were concerned with the politics of Brazil. Now that the impeachment process is finalized, I think investors are starting to look back into Brazil. So talking to some of our clients, managers that are taking trips to talk to investors in the US, the feedback I got was, well, my meetings, I'm having my meetings. I'm having a good numbers of meetings. The investors, the feedback they're getting from investors is, I'm not necessarily investing in Brazil right now, but I am starting to look at Brazil again as a possibility for the coming years. So I think, of course, the new government needs to implement the measures that they promised to implement so they can restore confidence. And then investors will start to come back and look at Brazil as a possibility. But Brazil is very relevant when you think of Latin America and when you think of emerging markets. So if you're an investor that you are interested in emerging markets, Brazil has always been relevant. But people were afraid of Brazil because of everything that was going on politically and economically. So I think now, slowly, I don't think it'll be a quick move, but slowly investors will start to come back, and that should help the investment management industry here in Brazil.
Francine, thank you so much for this interview.
I thank Dukascopy for the opportunity.
Luciane Miranda to Dukascopy TV.